Next up, I have Sandra Venghaus, and she's going to talk about proactive policy advice. Yeah,
Sorry. Thank you very much. I'm really happy to be here. Thanks to the organizers. I love how this symposium really gives us the big picture from like the big sort of policy conceptual ideas to the real sort of detailed technical analyses. I'm going to take you back to the more broader picture now, come back to us from a different angle, but some of the arguments rather that you have made. I'm not going to show you many results, but it's more, I guess, an invitation to collaborate. It's an early sort of research idea that I have. It's called Proactive Policy Advice, the potential of machine learning for predictive policy scenario generation. And it kind of rests on some findings that we've had that we're often too late when we give policy advice. And then to go back to the slides. All right. So the background essentially is that, as most of you will know, Germany and the EU have set out these huge energy transition targets, highly ambitious targets. These are enacted obviously through a quite complex policy system. We have the multi-level system between the EU and Germany, all the different policy fields coming together, the different sectors that are all sort of integrated in the system. And one of the core research objectives that we in our group actually have is sort of understanding these policy impacts and the governance implications. How do they shift our industries? And we rest our analyses mostly on modeling approaches, optimization approaches. We have a quite established energy system that is bottom up, starting from the technologies, builds up to the national system, European and also global implications. And so we try to really model these transformation processes. But when we look at the policies, we actually so far see two trends. It's either policy impact assessment, which is sort of ex post. So we look at did the policies actually achieve what they were meant to achieve, or it's sort of predictive, and then it sort of rests on these scenarios that we're generating. But what we're seeing is actually that we need sort of more rapid, faster responses and analyses to actually feed into the policy process. I'm not going to go into detail in this chart, but this is just sort of an overview of the past 25 years of policy making, electricity. And another example that I want to show here is when we look at synthetic fuels. And we're sort of seeing how just recently there's this immense number of different policies being implemented. And many of these still rest on these general targets. So if we look at the Refuel EU policy or target, it says we want to increase the share of sustainable aviation fuels from 2% to 70% between 2025 and 2050. But there's not much detail yet as to how this is implemented, how this is to be achieved. So what we're going to see in the future is a number of policies and regulations, subsidies to actually achieve this target. And all of these decisions obviously have sustainability implications. They have implications for our industry developments. And we need to be able to give fundamental feedback on how this is to be achieved and how sustainable this is actually. And this is to give you an overview of what we've done in the past, totally different topic. But on the left side, we actually see some of the big targets that we have. Targets for greenhouse gas emission reductions, primary energy supply, from the German EU level. And what we've done in this research, it's published, you can see that there, we wanted to understand the water and land system impacts of the future energy system. So what we did is we took these 2050 targets that go in the future and sort of linearly extrapolated, like where do we have to be? Then we used our big energy system model to analyze, and then we can sort of see, and the result is not that important in our talk here, but we could see sort of what the energy system in 2050 would look like. And then we went ahead and looked here, for example, under different scenarios, from where would we actually import the biomass that we're looking at. And these are sort of the kinds of scenario analyses that we're doing for the future. Another thing that we did, and this takes me closer to the policy impact, the policy side of it now, is we actually look at policy impact assessment. And here what we did is we used sort of a semi-quantitative approach, is what I labeled it. So we went through all of the public debates of the German Bundestag, the plenary sessions, from 2017 to 2022. with the question of how have certain crises and external events that have happened over the past years influenced the way that the energy triangle, the energy transformation is actually discussed in the political discourse. And what we can show kind of nicely here is that these events have had significant influence on the debates in the parliament. So for example, now I'll turn it off. So for example, what we see here, climate protection, 2018, 2019 was actually the most frequently discussed topic. That was the time of the Fridays for Future movements in Germany, Greta Thunberg, and this whole movement. And so this was a huge topic here. And then the COVID pandemic hit, and we actually see that as this happened, the share of topics on climate protection has actually decreased significantly. And it's set here, that orange line, which is the topic of affordability and competitiveness of renewable energies, becomes much more important because we have this economic crisis. And then we have the start of the war in Ukraine, and we actually see here, which is the green line, sort of how the topic of security of supply becomes much more important. And so these kind of analyses actually brought us to the idea that I think it should be possible to use these kinds of debates on politics to be able to much earlier sort of extract information on when a policy change is about to come. So the hypothesis, and this really still is a hypothesis, is whether we can use political discourses to identify when new policies are likely to emerge, if we have sufficient data, and there is a lot of the data on policy debates, but it should be possible to sort of predict changes and maybe quite early identify what possible changes might be, translate these into sort of more realistic rather than hypothetical policy scenarios that can then actually feed into our models and hopefully be able to generate results that we can feed back into the policy discourse as it's still ongoing before decisions have been made. So the idea is really to develop a forecasting tool that allows real-time forecasting and might be possible to revolutionize the policy advice so that we can actually come to more sustainable policy solutions. Why do I believe this is possible? So we have actually colleagues in our institute that are using natural language processing for data extraction. So what they're doing is they're feeding a whole set of scientific publications in this case into the model. And you see in the middle what kind of language features are extracted. So it could be a specific technology that is identified, and then the machine learning model goes through and looks at, here example, the properties, the nanosec efficiency, the different types of the technology. Then with the around, you have some kind of indication how certain is the number that's about to follow. Then you have units of electricity or energy, or here are the percentages. And this sort of feeds into a big technology data database where we have quite an understanding of how sort of the scientific agreement on the different technologies is. So the idea is that it might be possible to use a similar approach, but use it for these kind of policy shift in the policy debates. Now, it's going to make the whole thing a bit more complicated if we go into political debates, because obviously, although political discourse and the available data on it is vast, it's both skewed by political and individual interests. And of course, it's noisy, it's biased, and it's incomplete. And although policy change, policy design has long been a subject of a lot of scientific research, it's often qualitative in nature. And sort of the identification of the specific features like the language buzzwords for which we have to look that give us an indication that the policy change is about to come is much less understood. So the question, the hope is that with machine learning model, we'll be able to train this. But as I said, it's a research hypothesis at this point. So what have we seen in the past? So we have in our previous research been able to demonstrate that political discourse gives us indications on legislative changes We know that emerging trends are debated both in public debates that then feed into the policy process, and we see that the more topics are actually discussed in social media, for example, the more they also enter the political debates. And we've seen that machine learning models have a lot of power in identifying such trends. We've also looked at the scientific literature, and we see that there is already a lot of machine learning also used in policymaking. So here, Pollack et al., they highlighted the use of machine learning models by various governments actually during the COVID pandemic, to look at infection patterns, to see combine mobility data and how far people actually complied with lockdown decisions, and these kind of dynamics. We've also seen this publication where Google Trends data is actually used to monitor economic activity. So to see the frequency of different search terms giving an indication of certain economic dynamics. Or this publication that was used to forecast the makeup of Africa's future power grid. So also here, machine learning model and natural language processing have been used. And yeah, this brings us back sort of to the objective that we're trying to achieve. So in summary, we propose that using machine learning models to identify changes in the discourse can hint to policy shifts. And it could be hopefully a way of detecting early changes that could then be trained based on trigger words to identify key terms based on which these topics can be identified. And we hope that sort of then this information can be translated in quantified predictive policy scenarios. And then the idea would be to have sort of a flagging system that traces from the early beginning of such upcoming discourses, saying this is just an upcoming topic, but as time progresses, it becomes more likely. So there should be something like a likelihood factor, right? How likely is it that this regulation or policy interest is actually translated into a real policy? And then have something like an automatic generation of predictive policy scenarios if this is possible. So and as I mentioned, this is really an invitation to collaborate. So if you know someone who has worked with similar approaches, if you're interested in engaging in this, feel free to contact me, to contact us, and we'll explore this in the future. Thank you.
So there's thoughts, I think you're very much your presentation. I'm kind of curious, can sort of envision beyond just go react models to predict upcoming all of the images, you see an opportunity to like compare reacts long-term to establish goal from these false groups and models like the way you compare his policy that's likely would bring us closer to a farther away from these goals that we're requiring. So the two are going to use that to get into our policies.
I think it could be. So what we're seeing, or what we've seen, is a lot of policies are implemented in a certain sort of targeting a certain long-term target, but creating other problems along the side, right? So one of the big issues that we've had, biofuels first generation, that sort of were considered this helpful alternative energy source or fuel source, and then at the same time creating problems in land use, right? So we a lot of times have different negative side effects that are not considered when we're just looking at one long-term goal. And so if we're actually able to sort of put these scenarios into our models where we do consider a lot of different implications, then hopefully that would help us sort of detect, does it really bring us closer to the sustainability targets that we have, not just like one targeted policy target. So that would be the hope.
Yeah, so thank you for this very interesting presentation. Again, I'm not completely very interested in the topic that I'm doing. These models that is suggesting the outcome, like the prediction that they make. Should it be more like a quantitative thing, like okay, you'll have a policy on I don't know why it feels you have an actual number behind it? Or is it more like a qualitative idea where you say, okay, this tool will allow us to, as you say, identify maybe also side effects that we don't think about like now. What is the outcome of it?
Right, so the side effects would actually be included, are included in our extended sort of in the model that we're using anyway. But what we need for the models is to have some quantified feed into the model, right? So it could either be quantity targets, so saying this share of something, or saying effectively in a certain amount, so a number of like monetary incentive or a balancing, right? So we do need them to be actually model them. We need to have them quantified, so that would sort of be the next step. So the translation would be to go into the policy monitoring, what we're doing now, right? There are different types of regulatory impacts, but to be able to actually put numbers on them to feed into the model. That's sort of the idea. And the first idea would be to trace when new regulations are suggested.
So that I even these numbers that you not put in the policy.
Yeah, yeah, sure.
Getting lots of exercise.
Yeah.
This is very interesting. But as you were talking, the image that could not get out of my mind was a Frankenstein monster. So you got its natural processing, natural language processing, goes into this machine learning thing. I'm just wondering, wow, where is there a human to say, okay, no, you're going off on the wrong track. Really, you should be looking at something totally different that is consistent with all the data you're collecting, but that's not what the machines come up with.
Yeah, no, I think far from this. So what we're doing now in our analyses is, and Rega in your presentation did that. So we have this huge, vast amount of text data, and we use, for example, MaxQDA as a software that allows us to sort of code text manually, right? So we go through the document, read them and code and say, this addresses energy security, and this addresses, I don't know, affordability, and this addresses this technology and that technology. So we do this manually, but essentially we'll only detect sort of what we're actually looking for. And we're of course limited in the amount of data that we can go through per day, right? So even if we hire all of our students to help us with this work, it's still limited in the amount of data that we go through. So I think the main contribution of the AI in this case would actually be to help us, one, identify patterns that we don't sort of manually see, and allow us to go through a sort of a larger amount of data. But I don't see it as something that sort of goes on or off by itself without sort of our controlled understanding of what's happening. It's mostly, for example, I think like being able to find trigger words that hint at changes. I would imagine them going through, for example, the European Green Deal, or having chatted on receiving this happened before it was actually implemented in Europe. I think there could be patterns that in the AI can find that we wouldn't be able to manually.
Okay, that sounds good. I hope it goes that way.
We'll see. I'll keep you updated.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.